in terms of paying their bills, they care about the real rate of return. And so they're going to hope to earn an expected rate of return at the end of the day. They expect a certain amount because there's uncertainty with future inflation. So by putting the E here, we're kind of changing the context a little bit, using the same math, but now thinking about the decision making that's going on here. The one thing they have control of today is the interest rate, because that's what it's a voluntary contract. I'm going to charge 5%. I'm going to charge 6%. I'm going to charge whatever. So in terms of making a decision today, that's the one thing that they know. And then ultimately, depending on how inflation shakes out, that'll determine their real rate of return. In a bigger picture portfolio way that we'll talk about also, what also would cause their real rate of return to decline that is a little uncertain in this equation. We got the inflation uncertainty, I get that. But from a portfolio standpoint, I have 100 or let's say 1,000 car loans out there to people, and I've made 5% to this guy and 6% to this gal and 7% to this person, whatever. What also causes some uncertainty with the expected real rate of return? Default risk, yes. So that's another element that's kind of not being captured here explicitly, but implicitly when they set the interest rate, they're also thinking about default risk too. Some of those are going to go belly up. And so that could influence it. But the Fisher formula is exclusively getting this connection between inflation and the nominal rate of interest. All right. So we can kind of think about those going either direction of adding the real rate and the expected inflation rate together, or going back and forth. All right, questions or comments there? So the key is the banker knows, by the way, I say banker. In fact, let me be a little more formal. I sometimes say banker just to kind of keep it in our minds loosely here, but it's really the lender / borrower, both people on both sides of the equation, negotiate little I, the nominal interest rate. And they do so, that I is based on an inflation expectation, which then leads to a expected real rate of return. Okay, that's it, because that topic will come up a little bit more here in Chapter 5 as we work through it. Any questions? All right, Chapter 5, we're getting into some supply and demand. Oh, before we do that, I had a little reminder for ourselves. I sent out an email. Did everybody get the email about the Wall Street Journal thing? And so what happened when you tried to do something? It still wants you to pay money. Okay, so I wasn't 100% sure whether that link was going to ask you to pay money or not. Kaylee got on it, but she's also paid for it before. You paying for it now? You're a subscriber right now. Yeah. So she already had a subscription, so it just kind of sailed through. So is that what happened to all of you? I said don't pay, and it does hit a pay site of some sort? Okay. That I'm going to have to ask my rep about, because I wasn't sure if that's for the way it worked or not. So that might lead me to how I want to do, but I wanted to answer that question first. Okay, so hit the pay site. Got it. I will talk to my Wall Street Journal rep. There's a quiz function that the Wall Street Journal has where they give you current events and you take a short quiz. They collect the results of that quiz and then email it to the professor. So it's kind of a service that they have to stay on current events. And I had told you we're going to have current event assignments. So my thought was we might have I was trying to make it so that you didn't have to pay, I'm sensitive to that. And you can get the Wall Street Journal for free sometimes at the library or some other source. So you could potentially go outside of paying to get the article and do the work. But I was still hoping everybody would be able to take this little quiz. So I'll check with my rep and see how that shakes out. All right, so this next chapter is called The Behavior of Interest Rates. And we're going to look at, I'm going to start you off with the law of demand. Principles, class, micro, law of demand. What is it? As what goes up, something else changes. I'll give you a hint. So, law of demand. Number between 4 and 10. 5. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Kaylee, our lucky contestant.
We already talked about me.
So the demand curve is what we're kind of hitting at here. And so the law of demand, what do you got? Give me your best. It's wrong, it's wrong.
Yeah, it probably will be.
Okay.
As supply decreases, demand increases.
As supply increases, demand decreases. Okay, that's pretty wrong.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Okay. You're the lucky one. Go.
Entitled on the same line, but that's his plan manager.
So talk me through the law of demand. As, I like the as part, by the way, Kaylee, good job. As
demand increases, supply decreases.
He's not wrong.
Supply decreases. Okay, that is pretty wrong too. A couple of my top students, by the way. 1, 2. So I'm a little discouraged at this point. 1,
I didn't
2,
take micro from you.
3, 4, 5. Zach. That's true. Kaylee has the excuse she didn't take micro from me.
Okay.
As price goes up, demand goes up.
As price increases, demand decreases. Phew! All right, we're getting closer. It's still not real good, but it's a lot better than Kaylee's and Tag's. So we're on the right track. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Logan. So I'd like to. I'm saying you can kind of work with Zach's here a little bit. Zach's needs some polishing up. Kind of a significant amount of polishing, but at least it's getting us there. So as price goes up, what happens? Think about Dallas's water here. And as the price of water goes up, what happens to sales of water? They're going to sell less, so the quantity is going to be less, right? So as, I'm really helping Logan now at this point, but as the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. So that's a little polishing on Zach's, and the distinction here from micro is that that's the demand curve. Right? That's the demand curve. This is the quantity demand, and there's an important distinction there between those two. Still wrong, though. Now I'm going to open up the floor. It's really, really close to being right, but it's actually very, very, very wrong without these last 2 Latin words added onto it. Do. Ceteris paribus, yes. Ceteris paribus. That is so important because there's lots of things that influence the demand for water. How much money you make, right? Your income level. determines the demand for water. The price of soda might determine your demand for water, right? Because you might drink thirsty for soda or water, depending on the prices. Oh, I'll have a soda or I'll have a water. Price of soda goes down if those two things are substitutes. I might drink less water because soda prices are down. So price of related goods, expectations, all kinds of things in the real world that would disrupt this statement. And that's why I said it's so very wrong without that added on, because we're going to hold all other things fixed when we make this claim of the law of demand. So this law of demand gives us our demand curve. In fact, let me not do the demand curve. Let me derive it, because I think this is probably more important. At a $4 price of water, I want to buy 10 glasses. At $3, I want to buy more. At $2, I want to buy more, holding my income constant at $40 a year, for instance. So I'm not allowing my income to change. I'm not allowing the price of Coca-Cola to change. I'm not allowing anything to change. All I'm saying is it's cheaper. What do you want to do? I want to buy more, right? At $1, I want to buy more. At $2.50, I want to buy this much. At $3.50, I want to buy this much. At $1.50, I want to buy this much. And so if I keep doing that question, eventually the points get so close together that they resemble a line, right? And so I like to think of the demand curve and the supply curve as a collection of points, because it helps us remember that it's in two-dimensional space, and there's a story here between the quantity demanded and the price on a given function out in this two-dimensional world. The one-dimensional world is going to the axes and reading that number and that number. But here, it's a combination of two things going on, price and quantity. And the law of demand says as the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. Okay, questions there? So, other determinants of bond demand. The price of the bond is one of those things. We looked at them yesterday. If the price was selling at $1,200 for that bond, I'll buy this many. But at a different price, if it's cheaper, holding all of the things constant, I would want to buy more. But wealth plays a role in asset demand. If there's an increase in wealth, what happens to the demand function? In other words, this is a person worth $1 million, has $1 million net worth. What happens if that person gets a $2 million? Their assets grow to $2 million. Maybe they hit the lottery. Are they going to want more or less? More. So then that's where we get into these shifters, is that at $1 million net worth, I wanted to buy at $4, I wanted to buy 10 bonds. Now I want to buy more. At $3, I used to want to buy this much, now I want to buy this much because I'm a rich guy. Even at low prices, at this, when I was a millionaire, I wanted to buy this much, but I'm a multi-millionaire, I want to buy more. And so the demand curve shifts to the right when the wealth increases to W2 of $2 million. So an increase in wealth leads to an increase in bond demand, a shift to the right. A shift to the right. Oh yeah, and they're using, so I want to just to be consistent with the book here. I think they're doing a subscript D. instead of a superscript D rather than a subscript D. So just to be consistent, I'll try to do that. I try not to confuse you. So the textbook's got the little D up there for bond demand. All right, so what's wealth? How do we define wealth? If somebody's a millionaire, tell me how we came up with that calculation. Assets minus liabilities, right? So accounting class, it's a balance sheet item, right? What you own, assets, what you own minus what you owe gives you your net worth for your wealth. All right, so remember that wealth equals assets minus liabilities. It's a balance sheet item. What we own minus what we owe. All right, number 2. Expected return. Expected return. So this is the return expected relative to other alternatives. The return expected relative to other alternatives. So if there's an increase in the expected interest rate, kind of like there is now in the real world with the Federal Reserve doing their announcement shortly, the fee is they're going to stay flat. They're certainly not going to cut rates. They can barely do that. But whether they're going to increase interest rates. So if there's an increase in expected interest rates, what happens to expected prices of bonds? If future interest rates are looking like they're going to go up, what happens to the expected prices? They're going to be discounted, they're going to go down, right? So last time we left you with the inverse relationship between interest rates and the prices of bonds. They moved in opposite directions. Interest rates go up, prices of bonds go down, and vice versa. So an increase in expected interest rates leads to a decrease in expected prices of bonds. What's going to happen to bond demand? If prices are expected to fall in the future, do you want to buy bonds today? No, it doesn't follow kind of the buy low, sell high concept, right? Buy low, sell high says that this is a loser. Buy today, sell tomorrow. Things have changed. I'm going to lose money. And so that's going to decrease bond demand today. So special emphasis here on the E's that the expected prices make a difference on how we might behave today. Similarly, what happens if there's an increase in expected inflation? If there's an increase in expected inflation, what happens to the expected real rate of return? An increase in inflation, what happens to expected real rate of return? Goes down, right? This gets bigger, this gets smaller, and so that leads to a decrease in expected real rates of return, which again would lead to a decrease in bond demand. we might go seeking other assets. Now, one way to think about these alternatives is to think about real assets as opposed to financial assets. So financial assets are bonds, right? Stocks and bonds are financial assets. Real assets are classic cars and houses and investment property. If there's an increase in expected inflation, what happens to real assets? What happens to the expected return on real assets? If inflation kind of comes around, I buy a house for $100,000 and there's 10% inflation, those real prices are going to start to go up, right? Whereas with bonds, financial assets, we're going to have the opposite effect because they're fixed in their nature moving forward. So those two kind of different. So that's part of what we're playing with, is thinking about alternatives on what else we could do, what else we could do with our money. All right, risk. Risk. If there's an increase in risk, like default risk, for instance, what happens to the demand for those bonds holding all other things constant? So risk. So an increase in risk, things become more risky, decrease in bond demand, right? So holding all other things constant, that's going to tend to reduce bond demand. Remember the down arrow, think about it as a shift to the left. At each price, I don't want to buy as much. And so when we're thinking about risk, one of the key things, again, is the change in risk relative to other assets. It's the change in risk relative to alternative assets. If everything became more risky, then it's not going to cause us to change our portfolio. But it's one relative to the other. Number 4, liquidity. What was our liquidity from the whatever chapter? Chapter 3, I think. The liquidity. I like that. Fast you can turn it into cash, right? So liquidity is the how quick you can change to how quick you can change to cash. In other words, just sell it, liquidate it. And that we get that. If there's an increase in liquidity, if this particular asset became more liquid for some reason, easier to sell, what happens to the demand? It goes up. Liquidity is valuable. So where we saw this change rapidly is like during the financial crisis. So you have buyers for the bonds. So it was hard to turn into cash. You had to dump them at a real low price in order to get them sold. Some assets might have been more liquid than others. Okay. All right, so all of these things end up being shifters. how about the law of supply? So as price decreases, the quantity supplied of bonds so the price of a bond, the amount it's selling for on Wall Street, as the price goes down, supply goes down, right? Is that right? Sound good? I kind of tried to throw a little bit of a ringer at you by doing the price decrease. So prices of bonds are cheaper. Quantity supplied. Are you going to want to sell your bond? Is it more incentive to sell or less? Less incentive to sell, so you don't sell as much, right? So the quantity supply bonds decreases. Ceteris paribus. Holding all of the things constant. Okay. So we've got supply and demand based on prices, people holding bonds, and people wanting to buy more bonds. So it's kind of helpful to think of, well, some it kind of depends on what we're looking at, but many times it's helpful to think of this being a portfolio of bonds. Like you have some and you want to sell some. You might not sell all of them, but you're going to sell some of them in some cases, whatever. And so the quantity of bonds is based on the prices, which is what we're doing. Now, what's going on here in parentheses? Interest rates. Why? Why do we got price of bonds? And then I've got interest rates here too. We barely ever see that on the same axis, the vertical axis.
The lower the amount of interest rate, the higher you can sell it.
The lower the amount of interest rate, the higher you can sell it for. Okay? Somebody else? This seems pretty precise. Are they sure? Is that 5.3 and 11.1 and 17.6? What was the connection between price of bonds and interest rate? Inverse, and one drives the other, right? They're intimately linked together. If we look at, I like to just kind of come back for simplicity, the console. Who remembers that from Monday? The interest rate from a bond that is paid in perpetuity. What was that equal to? Coupon payment divided by the price, right? So if the coupon's fixed, which is given to you on a bond instrument, right? So if we're in the bond market, we know the coupon payment. It's purely mathematical. There's always an interest rate linked to the price. Always. So we can actually, some textbooks do it this way. Instead of putting prices here, they put interest rates. So you can do one or the other. The price of a bond is the interest rate, and vice versa, because they're all determined, one determines the other. Okay, so that you can go back and forth. So when you see something like this, we can kind of go either way with it. Interest rates low, bond prices high. That was that inverse relationship. Bond prices low, interest rates high. All right, so in this particular market, if bond prices are currently $9.50, what's going on? Just kind of hypothetically, if prices are at $9.50, there's what? A surplus. Good. So at a price of $9.50, the supply of bonds is 500, and the demand for bonds is 100. I guess not lining up. There you go. And so we have a surplus. There's more out on the market than what's being purchased. And so if the prices are fixed for some government reason, they say, oh, bond prices can't be below $9.50, that surplus would be persistent. We just have bonds that go unsold. There'll probably be some unhappy people because they want to sell their bonds, but they can't. Because we know that one way they can sell their bond is to drop their prices. As they drop their prices, more buyers enter the market, right? And the surplus starts to shrink, heading towards equilibrium. If they cut their price too much, what was this called? Microclass. Shortage or excess demand is another word we might use in this class. I guess it is, excess demand. Well, they're using with excess demand, but sometimes we call that excess demand. At a price of $7.50, the quantity demanded is 500, and the quantity supplied is 100. So we have excess demand, or we have a shortage of bonds, and people are going to start to bid prices up. And so whether we have a surplus or a shortage, it's not sustainable in a free market. There's going to be free market forces that are going to bring us towards this equilibrium where the two lines cross, where there's no shortage or no surplus. All right, so same story we told with beer and chicken wings and all of that stuff in microclass. I don't know if you had beer and chicken wings. That's what I do in microclass. But did you have beer and chicken wings in your class? See, my microclass, we talk about real things that are entertaining. So this class, we've got bonds to talk about, which is exciting for upper division econ, finance, and accounting folks, I guess. So we're going to be looking at the bond market. It's not quite as sexy as beer and chicken wings, but we'll make it. All right, so questions on basic supply demand. All right, a little bit of a warmer upper, but of course a little bit of a difference with using bond or the interest rates and prices the way that they work. Otherwise, it's really the same thing. Prices get smaller, we buy more, and so forth. All right. Supply consideration. I guess all right, supply shifters. So we got the law of supply. We had our demand shifters. These are our supply shifters. Number one, expected profitability. Expected profitability. So if there's an increase in expected profits, they will often do a poll of businesses and other people to get their profit expectations. So if things look rosy, increase in bond supply or a decrease in bond supply? Profit expectations high, increase in bond supply. Now let's backtrack to what is a bond in general? What is a bond? It's a financial instrument, financial security. In general, what is it? What type of financial instrument? A loan. So we're borrowing money. What are we borrowing money for? If we're a corporate bond, what are they likely doing with that money? Running off to buy an island out in the South Pacific? Investing in capital and machines, right? And so that's the link that I want you back to, thinking about the supply, is that we're back to business profitability. And if businesses expect higher future profits, they're going to reinvest into themselves with new machines, new buildings, whatever. If they do that through borrowing rather than equity, they're going to increase the supply of bonds. An increase in the supply of bonds, a shift to the right. Number 2, expected inflation, i.e. So if inflation goes up, if there's an increase in expected inflation, what happens to our real rates of return? I erased it, now we can't look up there. Look back in your notes. Inflation, expectations up. What happens to our real rates of return? They go down. So we have a decrease in our expected real rates of return. And in that environment, what's going to happen to bond supply? So expected inflation, there's going to be an increase in the supply of bonds, a sale of bonds. This one's kind of tricky. You got to think, when we're on the supply side, I want you to be thinking that you're holding on to a bond now. And do I want to dump it or do I want to keep it? Under this scenario, do I want to dump the bond or keep it? Hang on. Dump it, right? My expected returns are going down, so unload it. So this one's a little bit weird. We're going to increase the supply of bonds because we're going to dump the bonds. Dump the bonds. Sell, sell, sell. Sell, sell, sell. The rates of return are falling. This is like new news, hot off the presses. The Federal Reserve is taking on action to increase inflation. Oh crap, I don't want to be holding this bond anymore because the rates of return are going to fall. So I increase the supply of bonds. Number 3, government budget deficit. It could be surplus too, but let's not kid ourselves in the United States. But I guess to be complete, we could look at Germany, and they've been pretty good with surpluses. In fact, they were in the news recently that maybe they should change some things around, decrease taxes actually. They are shockingly one of the higher tax countries. And so some people were making the argument that they're running surpluses. This was actually a trade surplus, but maybe they should consider cutting taxes. So if it's a deficit, let's see, debt, deficit, what's the deal with that? Government debt versus government deficit. Debt is, let's see, where did we leave off with our number counter? Logan? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Joe, debt versus deficit.
Deficit's like a 1 year.
Okay.
100 basis.
Okay. And what does it mean in terms of the government? On a 1 year basis, what happened? What's that?
The inflow minus the government.
Inflow minus government expenditure. So inflow usually comes to us in the form of what?
Taxes.
Taxes. So if we think of government saving, that is equal to tax revenue minus government expenditure, T minus G. So this is a flow variable. If this is negative, it's a deficit. And as Joe said, so for 1 year we ran a deficit, we didn't collect enough taxes to pay for our weapons of mass destruction, and so we had to go and borrow, right? So negative government saving is equal to a deficit. You got to be sometimes careful. See how I did that? The negative sign, negative savings. When G is bigger than T, this expression is negative. It creates a deficit, which we usually talk about as a positive, right? If we say we had a deficit of 30 million, it was a negative 30 million savings. We were down 30 million, but we say a deficit of 30 million. It's kind of expressed as a positive. So government saving being negative, this expression is a deficit. And then how did that contrast that with the debt? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Debt. How does deficit compare to debt?
Keeps. And there's more debt. We get home more.
When there's more debt, we owe more. I'll buy that, but that needs a lot of help here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alex?
Debt is like over time. You said deficits.
Okay. So what? Give me something that ties together deficit with debt. If you could put that into some sort of sentence or a couple sentences, whatever you need.
Just like short-term versus long-term.
I'm going to let Alex come up with it. And no, it's not really short-term versus long-term.
Like the government had a deficit after 1 year.
Okay, of how much?
$10 million.
$10 million deficit, got it. Or saving negative, yeah.
But they have a debt to a certain country of $5 million now.
Okay, so they got $5 million worth of debt. And so if they had a deficit of negative 10, what's the new debt next year? 10 million, right? So we're adding on that. And so that's the difference between debt and deficit. It's a stock flow concept. The flow is the deficit. Every year, as Joe said, 1 year after year after year, if you run 5 years worth of a $5 million deficit, 5 times 5 is $25 million worth of debt you added to your debt pool. So your total debt is a balance sheet item, has meaning at a point in time. I owe the rest of the world $20 million right now. I can add up my debts, right, to everybody. Next year, if I don't collect enough taxes to pay for weapons of mass destruction, I have to go to the bond market and take on another $10 million worth of debt, right? And so that is a deficit that's going to add on to my total debt. All right, so that's important to keep that straight, deficit and debt, especially when we get into the bond market, because the government is competing with our private businesses in this marketplace. All right, so an increased deficit, which is what we found, an increase in the deficit leads to what with bond supply? We're on the bond supply shifter. Is that going to increase the supply of bonds or decrease the supply of bonds? A deficit. In a given year, G is bigger than T. Increase the supply of bonds or decrease it? Increase, right? They're going to go to the market. Obama's going to have to sign a whole bunch of these to pay for their bills. They're going to borrow, and so that leads to an increase in the supply of bonds. So when the government enters the market, going to increase bond supply and tend to put what on the price of bonds? What happens to the price of bonds then? Holding all those things constant, if there's an increase in the supply of bonds, bond prices go down, interest rates go up. So that behavior by the government causes interest rates to go up. And this ties into, I think we'll spend a little more time on it later, that crowding out effect that we talked about in macro class, where that causes interest rates to go up not only for the government, but for everybody. And therefore, it makes it harder for our corporate bonds to go get money on Wall Street or to borrow money. Their borrowing rate goes up when the government enters the bond as well. All right, that looks like a good spot to stop for today. We'll pick up and wrap up, by the way, Chapter 5 on Friday. And you've got your homework test stuff is set for Sunday, just to kind of